Welcome to the 700 Club. Hurricane Hermine hit Florida overnight with powerful winds and devastating flooding. It was the first hurricane to strike the Sunshine State in more than a decade.
Hermine has now been downgraded to a tropical storm, but it could still threaten parts of the East Coast in the days ahead. Gary Lane has the story.
Hurricane Hermine made landfall early this morning near St. Marks, Florida, packing 80-mile-per-hour winds. High winds and torrential rains of more than a foot led to 12-foot waves and extensive flooding. The storm battered homes and businesses along the northeastern Gulf Coast. Officials issued a mandatory evacuation order in some Gulf coastal areas.
Please protect the property and evacuate immediately.
Governor Rick Scott urged residents to stock up on 3 days of supplies.
Bottom line, it's life-threatening. If you need to go to a shelter, go now. Don't wait.
But many Floridians chose to hunker down and ride out the storm. Some boarded up windows, while others placed sandbags around their homes.
You know, when you live in Florida, this is what it is. You just listen and watch. If it gets bad, you leave. If you think you can ride it out, ride it out.
Even on their boats.
You got to stay on your boat so you can loosen your lines and tighten your lines.
Many neighborhoods are flooded.
Please slow down because these waves go into our houses.
Still about 4.5 inches of water inside the house.
And as the storm moves up through Georgia, 6 to 8 inches of rain is expected. Flash flood and storm surge warnings are in effect up and down the East Coast. Spin-off tornadoes are also a concern. Hermine is now a slow-moving tropical storm with wind gusts of 50 to 60 miles per hour. It's expected to track up coastal Virginia, the Delmarva Peninsula, and could strengthen again as it moves into the Atlantic off the northeastern coast. So heavy rains, flooding, and gusty winds will definitely put a damper on family holiday plans for millions of people this Labor Day weekend, and even cause problems at the start of a new work week. Gary Lane, CBN News.
Well, it seems like the worst of it is over, but if you're on the East Coast, prepare for a very rainy Labor Day weekend. In other news, Donald Trump says he's standing by his immigration plan. Wendy Griffith has that story.
Thanks, Gordon. Trump talked about his plan on the campaign trail in the key swing state of Ohio Thursday. Trump lost some support from Hispanic leaders after taking a strong stand on immigration in Arizona. Now he's talking about softening his position, but says his priority is still protecting Americans.
We will treat everyone with dignity, respect, and compassion. But our greatest compassion will be for the American citizen.
Meanwhile, the State Department now says it will release all of Hillary Clinton's schedules while she was Secretary of State. That will allow reporters to investigate more possible links between the department and the Clinton Foundation. New polls show the race tightening into basically a dead heat between Clinton and Trump. Islamic terrorists attacked a Christian neighborhood in northern Pakistan today. 4 gunmen stormed the colony with bombs strapped to their chests. They opened fire on any Christian they came across, killing at least 1. Local civilian guards immediately stepped in to stop further attacks. Well, it's an international movement against Israel called BDS. It stands for Boycott, Divestment, and Sanctions. Now, about 100 Christian leaders and Israeli Knesset members are working together to fight back against it. Chris Mitchell brings us that story from Jerusalem.
Some say serving in the IDF is not the only way of being a soldier for Israel.
Israel's safety and well-being are the responsibility of every Jew, of every Christian who loves Israel in every place and at every moment of life.
The Knesset Christian Allies Caucus and the Anti-BDS Caucus met for the first time recently here in the Knesset. Their aim? To showcase how important faith-based diplomacy is in Israel's current diplomatic battles. Joseph Sabag of the Israel Allies Foundation is spearheading the effort to push for legislation in the United States to fight the BDS movement against Israel.
In May of 2015, South Carolina became the first state in America to adopt modern legislation regulating against the problem of commercial discrimination and boycotts against Israel.
Since then, a dozen additional states have also taken action. The BDS movement focuses its campaign on Israeli companies operating in the West Bank, which encompasses biblical Judea and Samaria. Ironically, this affects Palestinians greatly, because when Israeli companies move, Palestinians lose good-paying jobs. Critics say the BDS movement isn't about justice or helping the Palestinians.
The danger of BDS is that Israel will lose its legitimacy to defend itself and ultimately lose its legitimacy to exist as a Jewish and sovereign state. Our enemies understand this very well.
What is going on with BDS as a global name for all the Israel haters is really the misinformation campaign that they're feeding to the general public and the miseducation that's going on the campuses.
Barry Shaw, author of BDS for Idiots, said it's simple.
The reason they're protesting only against the Jewish state and not the Arab states and regimes that abuse the Palestinians they profess to help is simply because Israel is the Jewish state. That's no more or no less than blatant anti-Semitism.
Shaw says if these BDSs were honest, their boycotts would include Israeli technology, like their own computers, laptops, and cell phones.
But they need these to communicate their lies and their false narratives to their supporters and to the general public.
Knesset member and former diplomat Michael Lawrence sees only one way to combat lies.
We beat terror through a combination of steadfastness and very good intelligence. We beat terror. But there's only one true defense and one effective weapon against delegitimization, and that is the truth.
Chris Mitchell, CBN News, Jerusalem. Mitchell, CBN News, Jerusalem.
Thanks, Chris. Gordon, it seems a scary thing when you have American churches lining up against Israel.
Well, if you support BDS, let me give you a quick history lesson because this is what you're supporting. You need to understand that the Palestinians could have had a state at any point in time since 1920, since literally the beginning of the British Mandate under the League of Nations. What was the condition? Well, the condition was recognizing that the Jews had a right to live in the land and recognizing Israel's right to exist. You can't have a two-state solution until the second state, the Palestinian state, says Israel has a right to exist and we no longer want to drive her into the sea. Back in 1967, right after the Six-Day War, so let's go back to 49 years ago, Israel offered the West Bank back and said, we will establish and we will agree to a Palestinian state there, offered not just the West Bank, but also the Gaza Strip. And the condition, here's the condition, you must recognize our right to exist. The Arab nations all said no, and they didn't just say no once, they said it 3 times. So until you hold them accountable, do you think Israel has a right to exist? Will you lay down your arms, your weapons, your terrorism? Will you stop trying to drive them into the sea? Until that day, until they say we recognize Israel has a right, well, then we'll never see peace, and you'll never see a two-state solution. Terry?
Well, up next, a modern...
Hermine charges ashore as a hurricane and batters Florida's Gulf Coast. Up to 15 inches of rain in some areas and, of course, heavy flooding along with that. Hundreds of thousands without power, trees down across the region, one even fatally crushing a homeless man in central Florida. Hermine now churning its way across Georgia. It's heading toward the Carolinas. It has been downgraded to a tropical storm, but it does remain a fearsome rainmaker. Some computer models suggesting it could follow the path of Superstorm Sandy, gaining strength at sea before slamming back into the eastern seaboard. We're covering all the developments of this storm from the CNN Weather Center to the path of the storm. Let's begin, though, with CNN's Brian Todd. He's in Charleston, South Carolina. Good morning.
Good morning, Carol. We're starting to see the storm surge really kick up here. This is the seawall along East Bay Street in Charleston, South Carolina. Look at the white caps here. You see a lot of the spraying along the seawall. We are just past high tide right now, and it is intensifying here. Some of the initial rain bands of the storm have already come through, and officials are telling us that they are advising residents to batten down the hatches for the next 24 hours. I'm going to climb up on the seawall here, put the mic down for just a second while I climb over here. Thanks, Dougal, my producer here, helping me out. What they're telling people here is, look, you have to take this seriously. This is what they're afraid of. A lot of gawkers, people like this coming out here and just out of curiosity wanting to be in the storm, wanting to feel it, they say that's not a good idea. The next 24 hours, they're telling people hunker down. They have handed out about 3,000 sandbags to people along this street and merchants near here, and they're going to be handing out more. Here's another warning, Carol. One official told us this is a city of high bridges. When the winds really start to kick up here in the next couple of hours, that's going to be a danger. Also, tornado watches along here, Charleston County and many adjoining counties, Carol. They're just getting into the danger zone right now.
All right, Brian Todd reporting live from Charleston, South Carolina this morning. Let's head to the CNN Weather Center now, checking with Chad Myers. Good morning. Tell us where this thing's headed.
Well, it's headed to Charleston in about I'd say maybe 10 hours or so. Brian will see the worst of his weather. What he sees there is the rising seas because of the wind coming onshore. Something else that will come onshore, Brian alluded to, tornadoes, the potential there. Every time a big storm rolls off the ocean, it could contain a water spout that will roll onshore and possibly create a tornado on land. These are small tornadoes, but they still cause damage. Something else Brian was alluding to, and you too. Where does this thing go after it leaves North Carolina? Well, it goes offshore. It goes off the Delmarva, off Rehoboth Beach, and it sits there. It could sit there for 3 days. Gain some strength, too, because there's still a lot of warm water there. We're seeing wind speeds on some of the computer models, Carol, of over 50 miles per hour, and eventually all the way from Nantucket all the way to Atlantic City, as far south as Tidewater, and it will be a rough weekend, no matter where you are here along the mid-Atlantic coast. This isn't going to be a pretty Labor Day weekend.
Oh, all right. Jed Myers reporting live for us. Thanks so much. Still to come in the newsroom. He was convicted of sexual assault. The former Stanford swimmer convicted of sexually assaulting an unconscious woman behind a trash bin is a free man today. He walked free from a California jail where he served just 3 months behind bars. Earlier this year, Brock Turner was convicted of 3 separate felonies, charges that could have resulted in 14 years behind bars, but the judge handed down that sentence of 6 months. Here's what the county sheriff had to say about Turner's early release.
And we don't know who picked him up or where he's going, but we're done with him. He should be in prison right now, but he's not in our custody.
Tough words from the sheriff. CNN's Ashley Banfield has been involved with the story since the beginning. She's covering Brock Turner's release. Good morning, Ashley.
Hey, Carol, I guess with the sound that you just heard from the sheriff, it would be pretty clear that there'd be no special treatment of his release, and I think that's an understatement. Those visuals just over an hour and a half ago of Brock Turner being released after 3 months of serving here at the Santa Clara County Main Jail, pretty stark. I mean, he was made to walk a gauntlet out of these doors behind me and then through sort of the bicycle racks with all the media set up. Didn't say a word. I think it's fair to say it's probably the last time he ever wants to see these doors and probably this county and maybe even this state. Conventional wisdom is he wants to go back to Ohio, Dayton, Ohio, where he's from. He left in that white vehicle, drove off. Destination unknown at this early stage, but at some point in the next few days, one of his destinations has to be an official office because that's where he needs to register as a sex offender, and that will be a repeated occurrence for the rest of his life. In fact, with all of the criticism of this very lenient jail sentence, 6 months for the 3 felonies, right? He served 3. Good behavior and overcrowding in the state means that you get 2 days of good time for every one you serve. He still has a pretty oppressive probation that's coming up, and then that registration regimen that he's going to have to follow for the rest of his life. Everywhere he goes, within a period of months, he's going to have to register and re-register and re-register, sometimes as frequently as 3 months. He will not be able to live in certain places or be in certain places without certain notifications. If/when he has children in the future, he may not be able to go to their games at their schools. I mean, there is a very strong sentence that continues that a lot of people won't see, that's more than just the actual jail. That said, there's a protest planned here later on because of this sentence that Judge Aaron Persky handed down. And the public defender in the case backed up Judge Persky and said some of those protesters may not have all their facts right. Have a listen to what he said.
The people that are saying that he has a repeated bias are absolutely factually and legally incorrect. Brock Turner was, 19 years old when this occurred? I believe so. And he had no record, and his past was, athlete aside, was pretty stellar. So he's done a lot in his life, in his short life, to say, I am a good person and that this was a mistake.
And then the facts of the case are such that this was a legal sentence. Judge Aaron Persky operated within the confines of the law. It was just sort of at the very edge of that law, and that's why all those protesters are coming out here later on this morning. Carol, we're going to continue to cover this for you and hear what they have to say about all of this morning.
And good morning. I'm Carol Costello. Thank you so much for joining me. Talk about whiplash. When it comes to immigration, Donald Trump's tone hasn't exactly been consistent. Now, many voters still don't exactly get where he stands on deporting those 11 million undocumented immigrants in the United States. Here's what he said last night on Fox News.
We're going to get rid of all of the bad players that are here, the gang members, the gang leaders, the drug dealers, all of the cartel people. We're going to get them out of our country. After that takes place, which will be a process, and it won't go that quickly, but it's going to go as quickly as any human being can do it. After that takes place, we're going to sit back. We're going to assess the situation. We're going to see where we are, because we'll have people in the country that that have come in illegally. We're going to sit back. We're going to assess the situation. We're going to make a decision at that time.
Okay, so here's what Mr. Trump has said in the past. Mr. Jackson.
Thank you.
So clear this up. I'm glad you're here. Clear this up for us. Did you submit questions to the Trump campaign before the interview?
Sure. I'm the one that sat down with the New York Times reporter, and one of the questions that she asked, did we submit questions to the Trump campaign beforehand? And yes, I didn't see anything wrong with it. I never lied about, or tried to be deceitful about it. But we have, in the past, I have done things for the White House. I did an invocation, just a prayer, about a year ago when Joe Biden was in, Vice President Biden was in town. And before I even did the prayer, they asked me to submit what I was going to pray. So I didn't see anything wrong with it. I felt like if he even had advisors, I didn't know what his camp was going to do with it. I just sent the questions out. They were hard questions. They were direct questions, and they were questions that I feel African Americans needed to know.
I think that some people would say, wouldn't it be better if Donald Trump were to give spontaneous answers, because those answers would come straight from the heart?
Well, these answers, I mean, these questions are not going to be just solid. Matter of fact, I have questions that they don't know about, no one know about. I changed them after that came out. Now, I want to make something very clear. There was no coercing with the Trump campaign and myself to try to get him an upper hand on these questions. I'm concerned, and we need to keep the focus on this. I'm concerned with Mr. Trump, and not only me, other African Americans are concerned about. He has made statements, and his statements are that I want to make the black community better. Well, he never has, to this point, sat down with anyone. So we want to know the answers. We want to know how you're going to do that. There's a lot of perception out there that there's a lot of racist people that are following his campaign. These are questions that we're going to ask. And then when it's all said and done, then let the people decide. So I want the people
well, let me ask you this, because another part of this New York Times article said that Trump aides would work with your network to edit the taped interview.
That's not true. No, that is not true. Then it'll be tainted. It would be tainted, and it would not be good. No, this was never been discussed with me. For her to say that, I don't know where she got that from, but she didn't get that from me or my media team, because this was never discussed between me or my media team that there would be any type of them having their hands on it. Once we have the interview, we will have it, and we'll show it raw like it is.
Okay, and then my final question to you, sir, is Donald Trump is now going to speak face-to-face with your congregation. I interviewed you yesterday, and you said that he would be sitting in the church service but not talking directly to the congregation. So is he now going to do that?
Well, again, I don't know where all this information coming from. Now, I'm the pastor. I'm the pastor. I know nothing about it. Donald Trump is going to be a part of our service that since he's in town, he's going to stay for service. We have service on Saturday. We have service on the Saturday. So he's going to stay for the service after the interview. And then if he greets the congregation, as we do with all politicians or all visitors, if he wants to say, hey, I'm Donald Trump, I'm glad to be here, and it's not going to be an interview or speech to the congregation, because if that was something that anybody's got, they didn't give me the news. So I don't know where that's coming from. But as what I know is that he's coming for the service after we do the interview, and he wanted to meet and talk to some people while he was here. That's what his visit is all about. His visit is not just to get an interview for, with Impact Television Network, but it is, amen, to make sure that while he's in town, talking to people, because he's been criticized, that he's been preaching to African Americans from a backdrop of white people.
Right, and I understand. And Bishop Wayne Johnson, I'm glad you came on and clarified all of this, because we've been talking about it most of the morning, and it's always good to have things straight from the horse's mouth, so to speak. And of course, we'll be following what Mr. Trump says inside your church, and of course, what he says to you when you sit down to interview him. Thank you so much for joining me. And thank you for joining me today. I'm Carol Costello at this hour with Burbett and Baldwin after a break.
Welcome to the 700 Club. Hurricane Hermine hit Florida overnight with powerful winds and devastating flooding. It was the first hurricane to strike the Sunshine State in more than a decade.
Hermine has now been downgraded to a tropical storm, but it could still threaten parts of the East Coast in the days ahead. Gary Lane has the story.
Hurricane Hermine made landfall early this morning near St. Marks, Florida, packing 80-mile-per-hour winds. High winds and torrential rains of more than a foot led to 12-foot waves and extensive flooding. The storm battered homes and businesses along the northeastern Gulf Coast. Officials issued a mandatory evacuation order in some Gulf coastal areas.
Please protect the property and evacuate immediately.
Governor Rick Scott urged residents to stock up on 3 days of supplies.
Bottom line, it's life-threatening. If you need to go to a shelter, go now. Don't wait.
But many Floridians chose to hunker down and ride out the storm. Some boarded up windows, while others placed sandbags around their homes.
You know, when you live in Florida, this is what it is. You just listen and watch. If it gets bad, you leave. If you think you can ride it out, ride it out.
Even on their boats.
Got to stay on your boat so you can loosen your lines and tighten your lines.
Many neighborhoods are flooded.
Please slow down because these waves go into our houses.
Still about 4.5 inches of water inside the house.
And as the storm moves up through Georgia, 6 to 8 inches of rain is expected. Flash flood and storm surge warnings are in effect up and down the East Coast. Spin-off tornadoes are also a concern. Hermine is now a slow-moving tropical storm with wind gusts of 50 to 60 miles per hour. It's expected to track up coastal Virginia, the Delmarva Peninsula, and could strengthen again as it moves into the Atlantic off the northeastern coast. So heavy rains, flooding, and gusty winds will definitely put a damper on family holiday plans for millions of people this Labor Day weekend, and even cause problems at the start of a new work week. Gary Lane, CBN News.
Well, it seems like the worst of it is over, but if you're on the East Coast, prepare for a very rainy Labor Day weekend. In other news, Donald Trump says he's standing by his immigration plan. Wendy Griffith has that story.
Thanks, Gordon. Trump talked about his plan on the campaign trail in the key swing state of Ohio Thursday. Trump lost some support from Hispanic leaders after taking a strong stand on immigration in Arizona. Now he's talking about softening his position, but says his priority is still protecting Americans.
We will treat everyone with dignity, respect, and compassion. But our greatest compassion will be for the American citizen.
Meanwhile, the State Department now says it will release all of Hillary Clinton's schedules while she was Secretary of State. That will allow reporters to investigate more possible